right, good morning, colleagues. Good morning, guests. I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 99 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs. We recognize that we meet on the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee is meeting today for its study of the opinion by the Supreme Court of Canada on February 9th, 2024, regarding an act respecting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children, youth, and families. I'd like to now welcome our witnesses. From Department of Indigenous Services, we have Katrina Peddle. Make sure I have, good morning, Katrina. Director General, Act Respecting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Children, Youth, and Families Branch. And Katrina is joined by Isabel Quintel, Acting Director General, Strategic Policy and Planning Directorate. And from the Department of Justice, we have Valerie Phillips, Director and General Counsel, Aboriginal Law Centre, and Paula Quigg, Senior Counsel, Aboriginal Law Centre. So welcome. Colleagues, our normal rules for the committee allow for a 5-minute opening statement, but the departmental officials have asked for 10 minutes since this is a one-off study and to set the stage. And so I'm going to ask for unanimous consent to allow a 10-minute opening statement, and then we'll get right into the rounds of questions. Okay, I'm seeing agreement with that. Okay, Leah, you're good? Okay, perfect, and welcome. So we will have 90 minutes with our officials on this study, the one-day study that we're doing, and then we will move into committee business, and we'll go into that when we get to that point of the agenda. So at this point, and I'll use a handy card system here, so when you have 30 seconds left, I'll give a yellow card. When the time's up, I'll give the red card. Don't stop mid-sentence, but just kind of wind up your thoughts, and then we'll keep things moving along that way. And so I will get on my timer 10 minutes, and whenever you're ready, the floor is yours. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. Kwei, bonjour, good morning. Thank you for the invitation to present, to discuss an act respecting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children, youth, and families. My name is Katrina Peddle. I'm the Director General for the Act, as the Chair has mentioned. I'm a member of the Qalipu First Nation, and I'm happy to be with you this morning. I'd like to thank my colleagues for attending with me and appreciate your time to discuss this important piece of legislation. In terms of my purview, I am really just the DG for the Act, so happy to answer questions about it. Beyond that, I may have to take it back for further comments, but do appreciate any questions that you may have. And my Department of Justice colleagues are here to answer technical questions that you might have about the recent opinion of the Supreme Court regarding the Act. So as you know, the Act was really a response that was enacted with the support of all parties to respond to what was really a national crisis about the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in child welfare systems across the country. This is not a new problem. This is a problem that has existed over many, many generations, from residential schools to the 60s scoop to the overrepresentation now, which actually represents a huge, huge number of children from communities from coast to coast to coast. The real goal of the Act is to address this legacy and to do things here and now to address that overrepresentation and to importantly put jurisdiction back to where it's always belonged, in the hands of communities to direct these child and family services themselves. I will answer in layperson's terms around the Supreme Court, and I'll hand it over to my colleagues for technical views on things, but certainly from where we sit at Indigenous Services, we were very happy to see that we were able to continue to do the work that we've been doing over the past several years to implement the Act as it was found to be constitutionally valid in its entirety. And that, you can imagine from where we sit, was welcome news. We also were really happy to see the endorsement of the work of Parliament to affirm the Indigenous community's inherent right of self-government relating to child and family services, and that enshrining this in law is indeed constitutional. I think for this committee, the decision really does point to the important role of Parliament in deciding to do things quickly, in deciding to put a timeline for reconciliation that may move faster than traditional tools like the courts. And so really what we hope to do and continue to do is to address the harms of the child welfare system that are happening, here today, and also to work to improve the amount of reconciliation that we can do in the span of time that we have in front of us. So really it is about making things move as quickly as we possibly can. So practically speaking, from where we sit, what that means is we continue to do the work in partnership with Indigenous communities who have already asserted jurisdiction, and see some of the great success stories that they're having in terms of the work that they're doing on a community level. We've seen that with Peguis. We've also seen that with Splatsin and other communities across the country. It does mean that the urgent work underway doesn't have to slow down, and we can sort of work through the model that we have to continue to get this work done as quickly as we can. So in terms of that, you'll see in your materials something that looks like this. You'll see it in the materials attached to your agenda. And I just wanted to talk in terms of practico-practic, what it means for us when we say communities are reasserting jurisdiction. So for us, there are sort of 4 key components. There's the vision, there's the signal, there's the coordination, and there's the implementation. So you can imagine communities have not just been thinking about reasserting jurisdiction for the past, several years that the Act has been enforced. This has been a conversation that's been happening around the country for decades. So many communities, when this legislation was co-developed, came really ready to put their laws into place and really ready to move quickly. So what we have done as part of implementing the Act is to provide capacity building funding. You'll see that's sort of the second piece on that graphic that I've shared with you. And so about 220 Indigenous governing bodies, so that's basically a group that's been delegated by a community to say, we want you to do this work on our behalf, have started to do that work of saying, okay, what is our law going to say? What do we want to do? What lessons have we learned interacting with the status quo that we want to change? What are the things that we know we want to do, and what pace do we want to do it at? So that work can take a year, it can take 3 years. It really depends on the pace at which communities wish to proceed. It also has to happen in the context of the many, many other things that communities are dealing with on any given day of the week. So once that capacity building work has been done, then there will be a signal, which happens usually through Section 20 of the Act. And the signal either is, we're going, or can we please sit down together? Typically, the signal is, can we please sit down together? And about 75 Indigenous governing bodies have given us that signal since the Act was put into force several years ago. And what that means really is, okay, we are thinking about doing this, let's get ready to go. And then for where we sit, this is where some of the most important work happens, as we have 3 parties, typically the provinces, the federal government, and the Indigenous governing body, who are working together to try and map it all out. Because it's a hugely complex sphere, right? Children are in different places. Sometimes children are living in communities. Sometimes there's not a connection to community. They're trying to work all that out. So what that period of time does, and it can be an extensive period of time. We aim for 12 months, but we recognize now with a bit of experience that it can take longer. We are really just trying to put the pieces together with the leadership of communities to make sure that we can get the best coordinated services and enter into a long-term funding arrangement so that the jurisdiction is assumed with the support that communities need. Once that coordination piece is complete, and it is a significant piece of work, I won't underestimate that for you. Then we move into the implementation phase, where communities have reassumed really jurisdiction over their child and family services, and then we continue to work with them as need be. But typically, as you would see in any other type of self-government, the community is doing that work of jurisdiction and doing the work of making sure that children are where they belong, which is close to home, and making sure that families get to see the difference, in the short, the medium, and the long term in terms of those outcomes for children, but also the outcomes for the families themselves. I would also just say there is a lot of this work that reflects some of the commitments that ISK and others have made to the implementation of UNDRIP. And the Supreme Court was clear that this type of work is legislative reconciliation. It does create an important emphasis for the role of parliamentarians to do this work. And I just would like to conclude by saying we'll continue to collaborate across different levels of government to support the work of the Act. And certainly we're delighted to have the opportunity to discuss it with you here today. We all care greatly about it. And we'd be happy to answer your questions. Certainly the technical ones we'll refer to our justice colleagues. Waliak.
Great, thank you. And ahead of the 10 minutes, so well done, thank you. We're going to get into our first round of questions, which are 6 minutes for each of the parties. And just let me reset this. First up, I have Mr. Schmale, who has 6 minutes whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today on a very important topic. Maybe I could just, for those potentially watching or listening at home, we can quickly, in 30 seconds or less, explain how the model works. If a child is taken into custody by a provincial organization, however that goes from there, the cost, I believe, is given to the province for that child. Is that correct?
So that is a very good question. I will try for 30 seconds. I'll try my absolute best. So it depends on which distinction-based group you're speaking about, and it depends on whether there's a First Nations agency that is working with the community or not. But typically, funding that would come through the First Nations Child and Family Services program to fund communities often will flow to a province if there are services that are being provided by a provincial agency, yes. What would be different under the Act if, say, for example, a community that has assumed jurisdiction, then it would be the community that would have that funding, and it would be the community that would decide what is the course of action. And the real big difference that we've seen, and we see this elsewhere in provincial child welfare too, is a big focus on prevention. What we often think of child welfare is we think of apprehension, we think of foster care, we think of kids being away from the home. And what the Act really tries to do is front end the other actions that can be taken to prevent that, right? To support families, to support communities, to sort of provide a different context so that apprehension doesn't need to happen and that child can stay with their family.
Perfect. So I take it everyone has seen that Global News article about Indigenous kids in Northern Ontario specifically. Now, given that the majority of those kids mentioned in the article were given to the provincial agency for, if you can say care, I guess. Are steps being put in place so that we don't have more stories where we're being seen headlines like Indigenous kids are being used as cash cows?
Thank you, Chair, for the question. I think absolutely you see that with the implementation of this jurisdiction. Children are being kept within communities. I think about the example of Peguis. I think about the example of Wabaseemoong, where children are being kept closer to home. And there's a lot of focus also if a child needs to be apprehended, like what is the circle of care around that child? So that would start immediately with the parent or parents or people in a role of a parent. Then you're thinking about aunts, uncles, cousins, caring folks in that child's life. And what other resources that the community might have. And then you think about Indigenous people outside of that circle, and then only outside of all those concentric circles would you think of a situation where a child would be in care really in that distant kind of way. So really the purpose of the Act is to avoid exactly that.
So the communities I'm speaking with, many are saying they've had enough of the Ottawa Knows Best approach, kind of what you're saying, how the communities want the control of the care of their kids, which I think all of us support in this room. Having said that, according to this Global News article, the disparity in the cost. So apparently, according to this article, a for-profit group home in Northern Ontario gets about roughly 26% more funding for an Indigenous child compared to a non-Indigenous child. Is there been any accountability for that money, given that we are seeing case after case of neglect and wrongdoing in many cases? It doesn't seem like the extra money is being put into culturally appropriate care or anything like that. It just seems like the money's being paid, the children are off somewhere, and according to the article, sometimes hundreds of kilometers away from their families or their communities. If the Indigenous communities are saying, we're ready, if this abuse is happening, how much time are we talking about till this gets corrected?
That's a very good question, and thank you for it. I think that what we see is a problem that everyone recognizes across the board, right? The status quo is not working. There have been significant investments in the First Nations Child and Family Services program, so that program's funding has increased by about 200% since 2006. However, the taking control of those services, right, the jurisdictional piece under C-92 does take a period of time, right? So what we hope to see is that a community seeks to assert jurisdiction, moves through capacity building relatively quickly. It can happen in less than a year depending on this, what communities wish to do and the timing of that, and then move through coordination and agreement discussions, and then they've assumed jurisdiction. And when jurisdiction's been assumed, those decisions about how the services will be run and with whom they contract are made by the community.
Sorry to cut you off.
Yes,
I'm
go
sure
ahead,
on time.
please.
But this has been building for years. According to this Global News article, it's been going on for over a decade, and probably well before that, before some of these figures came to light. So what has been done in the department? This can't be news to people in the department that this is all of a sudden bad. And I'm not blaming anyone at the table. I'm just saying that this has been going on for decades. How is this still going on? This must have come across somebody's desk.
That's a great question. Thank you. I think that there is general recognition. I think we see it in the department. The Supreme Court said it. The number of children, Indigenous children in care in Canada is a shocking number. There is no doubt about that. I think what the Act has tried to do over the past 5 years is to address that the system does not work as it is, and that there needs to be a huge systemic change where communities take control of child and family services, and then those decisions relating to that are under the community's control.
Okay, we're out of, that's the 6 minutes. Okay, we're going to go now to Mr. Batiste for his 6 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for that presentation. I know that noticed the presentation you talked a lot about the government response to what the case said, but not a lot as about what the case actually said. I'm wondering if you could give us what are the 3 big takeaways from the department on what this case said.
Well, perhaps I'll defer to my Department of Justice colleagues and I can fill in at the end. Thank you.
So thank you very much for that. I can provide, if it's helpful, a summary of the main points of the decision, if that's helpful, or of the opinion of the Supreme Court. So certainly on February 9th, the SCC rendered its unanimous opinion on the Act. The reference question before the court was quite specific, and I think that's something important to recognize. So the court was specifically asked whether the Act respecting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children, youth, and families was ultra vires the jurisdiction of the Parliament of Canada under the Constitution Act. And the Supreme Court of Canada's answer to that question was no, it was not ultra vires. So in doing so, the court, in its opinion, confirmed that the Act as a whole is constitutionally valid under Section 9124, and that includes the national standards set out in the Act, the affirmation of inherent right of self-government, which includes legislative authority over child and family services, and the incorporation by reference of certain Indigenous laws into federal law, and the giving of those laws of paramountcy over provincial and territorial laws. The court significantly found that it was not necessary for purposes of determining the specific reference question before them to determine whether or not the right of self-government is indeed a right recognized and affirmed by Section 35 of the Constitution Act. The analysis then in the reference opinion, again, concerns the Act as a whole. The court applied a 2-part test to determine the Act's constitutional validity. So it identified the pith and substance, or the essential character of the Act, and then it classified it by reference to the heads of power in the Constitution Act 1867. And it found that the essential matter of the Act involves protecting the well-being of Indigenous children, youth, and families by promoting the delivery of culturally appropriate child and family services, and in so doing, that it was advancing the process of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. So the court found that that falls squarely within Parliament's legislative jurisdiction under 9124. And it also found that the 3 features of the Act were all measures that were also within Parliament's exclusive legislative jurisdiction. So the establishment of national standards and principles, the affirmation that was set out in Section 18.1 of the Act, that the inherent right of self-government is an Aboriginal right recognized and affirmed by 35, and the framework to facilitate the implementation of Indigenous laws, notably by giving paramountcy to certain Indigenous child and family services laws over provincial laws. So I can go on and elaborate on those points, but I recognize there's
I
a
want
time
to take you on a different journey on this case, because this case was one of the first ones as a former Indigenous academic who taught Aboriginal and treaty rights. It was the first time I saw the Supreme Court of Canada use words like braiding of legal norms when they talked about the braiding of Canadian law with the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People and Indigenous laws, and that moving forward, the law has to look at braiding these legal traditions together all in one. And I thought, can you speak to what that potential means for legislation moving forward or laws in Canada? I read it as saying that the Supreme Court is giving direction to parliamentarians to saying that when we look at laws, that we also have to look at the Indigenous laws themselves and the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People together with those laws. Would you agree with that kind of summarization of it? Because you have about 2 minutes left to kind of explore this concept that was unique to this case that I haven't seen in any other legal case before.
It may be most efficient in our 2 minutes to refer you to my colleague Valerie Phillips, who works quite a great deal on the UN Declaration.
Thank you for the question. It is an interesting statement by the court. They really talk about that in terms of legislative reconciliation, and they talk about that in the broader role of Parliament and parliamentarians. They make reference to the ability of Parliament to have a conversation with society and the courts, and how in passing laws like C-92, even if, for example, they do find that they make findings around the self-government formation, there's still a message being sent by parliamentarians to society and the courts. So in terms of what that means in terms of the larger interpretation of Canadian law and the braiding of laws, I think that remains to be seen. They don't provide specific guidance, but it certainly is giving a message that the UN Declaration should be considered by courts in interpreting laws and should be part of parliamentarians' consideration of laws.
20 seconds.
I'll get back to you on a third round on following up on legislative reconciliation. Get ready.
Okay, thank you. We'll now move to Monsieur Lemire, and when you're ready, you have 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, indeed, I will continue in the same vein. Many people say that there are still practices that are not acceptable, that Indigenous children are being subjected or rather removed from their societies, from their communities, and children should be better protected. The overrepresentation of Indigenous children in care can be attributed to a political system which is guided by Eurocentric opinions, but also by governments, successive governments, that did not really deal with the underlying causes of this poverty. So there is need for a fundamental paradigm change, and living together also means developing together and having faith in Indigenous communities and giving them financial predictability so that they can introduce measures to help families and children, that they will develop themselves to improve the sort of children. And they should also have the capacity to develop and deliver their own services. So these are some elements that I noted from my conversations from different groups and communities. When we look at your graph, we see that more than $200 million have been spent to develop these capacities, but how much money has really been delivered to Indigenous communities to date? Thank you for the question. It's a really good question. In terms of capacity building, we're looking at $200 million plus the number exact. The exact number, you have it in the document. And in total, there's also a $1.6 billion envelope. But I do agree with you that it requires financing that is a bit represents outside the box thinking, if you will. And the target of this act is to promote, really, that's one of the principles of the act, to allow the community so that they have the means to face the big questions and challenges, the important and difficult obstacles in their way. They should be able to decide where they want to put their resources and what they would like to prioritize to offer different services for children. While statistics are really alarming, 54% of children who are in care in Canada are Indigenous, but they represent only 8% of the youth population in Canada. So the opinion, of course, deserves respect, but we have to ask the question about the implementation of certain elements that have to do with the implementation of the criminal code. Some of these are within the jurisdiction of provinces, as long as it doesn't go beyond 2 years in terms of the prison sentence. So the question that remains before us, even after this opinion, is how can Indigenous communities really assume this responsibility of taking care of children and the youth? Because we're probably going to need billions of dollars. Will the federal government really play that role and really allow Indigenous communities to fully assume these responsibilities? Thank you for the question. I think we're still studying the decision, the ruling. I can pass it on to my colleagues to answer more detailed questions about financing, but there needs to be a better coordination between provinces, territories, and the federal government and the different communities to make sure that they all come together and work together to provide the right child and family services. And of course, financing should also be part of that effort. Thank you for the question. I'm going to answer in English to make sure that I'm conveying precise information.
Speak specifically to finance and funding of the program. I think that is what your question was. They don't speak specifically to that.
That is the problem, because now we're in a political matter, and we all are trying to, of course, favor the self-determination of Indigenous communities. But if we're not taking the responsibility of who's going to pay, at the end of the day, it's the Indigenous child who will be the most impacted potentially by this. And if the bill is again sent once again to Quebec, then that digs deeper into the financial injustices. So will the federal government take or assume its responsibilities in line with this decision? So who will pay for it? That is a very good question. And if we look at the Child and Family Services Program, we see that there's been a 200% or so increase in the financing for these programs to make sure that there's a certain level of financing funds available that will be made available to Indigenous communities in Canada. And when you look at the agreements that have been signed to date, you also see that there's financing that meets the needs. It's communities who indicate what their needs are. They build their own models and priorities. So the objective here is to make sure that the financing is over the long term. We have 10-year agreements with many communities. So we're trying to make sure that it's not just going to be there for the next year or the 2 years. I'd like to hear you a bit about the consultation mechanisms with Quebec specifically. Are you going to share the tripartite consultation meetings and the information coming from that? Will you make that information public? Well, thank you for the question. I think we need to refer to our colleagues from the Department of Justice, and these are agreements with the communities, and we cannot, of course, do that unilaterally without their consentments.
It's the end of the time. Okay, we'll now go to Ms. Gazan. Sorry, Leah.
Oh, no.
Hey, Ms. Gazan,
it's like you
the floor is yours
combined
for
both
6
my
minutes.
names there.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for being here today. My first question, you spoke about capacity building, and I'm looking at Government of Canada website about the funding for capacity building. Is it not proposal dependent?
Thank you for your question.
Just a yes and no,
Yes,
just because I have.
It is proposal dependent at this time, yes.
So just because a community submits a proposal wanting to build capacity so that they can obtain jurisdiction doesn't mean they're actually going to be supported for it. Is that right?
To date, communities are typically supported for it, yes.
Okay, but it doesn't necessarily mean they will be. Is it a guarantee when they put in a proposal that they will be provided what is needed to build capacity?
There are
Yes or no?
certain criteria that must be met.
Okay,
as
so
to-
no.
Yes.
Okay, so just moving on, it says that, sorry, it says yearly maximum funding as per funding chart below. The number of proposals received, so it doesn't, it goes actually farther to say, like, let's say everybody met the criteria, but there wasn't, it would still depend on the number of proposals received and the total funding available. How much funding is currently available?
The current funding is $100 million per year.
$100 million a year. So so you can have more than $100 million of communities, because we're talking about reconciliation, wanting to get our kids back. And if it exceeds the $100 million, there's no extra money for that. Is that right?
At the current time, I will say, to date, we've not had to turn people down. We've been able to meet those
Okay.
requests. Yes.
But it is a possibility.
It's certainly a possibility.
It's certainly a possibility. Okay. So just going on to and building on to what my colleague from the block was talking about funding, one of the concerns from the Caring Society for Children and Youth, Cindy Blackstock, she said, it is up to the provincial, territorial, and federal governments to make sure they provide the resources and supports needed for First Nations, Métis, Inuit children and youth. It goes on. The problem is there's a huge gap as Indigenous nations do not have the resources or often the capacity to do this on their own. How much funding has been allocated for child welfare services on reserve to date?
That is a question I'll have to return to you with an exact
If
number.
you could, if you could, because I mean, this current federal government, after over 13 non-compliance orders, were ordered to pay a Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ruling to immediately stop racially discriminating against children on reserve. Something that they ended up paying $17 billion less than was asked by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ruling. So although I know that there's good talk of reconciliation and in terms of giving our kids back, it often doesn't come with money. Is there a plan with the federal government to ensure that any child welfare system, any community assuming a jurisdiction over a child welfare system will be provided equal amounts of allocated funding as for kids off reserve? Has that been affirmed?
That's a very good question. Thank you for that question. The agreement in principle regarding long-term reform of the Child and Family Services Program does provide that there will not be less that will be provided under the Act than a First Nation would receive under the agreement in principle. So yes.
Agreement in principle. It hasn't been agreed upon yet.
Yes, that's correct. It's not been completed.
Where is it in the process of being agreed upon? Because it's one thing to provide jurisdiction, like with Peguis, and I totally support that. I'm a Manitoban. 90% of kids, over 90% of kids currently in the child welfare system are First Nations or Indigenous. Totally support that. But there doesn't seem to be a measure. Am I right? Like, is it just arbitrary amounts of money, or is there a measure to ensure that kids are going to receive equal funding to kids off reserve?
Your question, I just want to make sure I understand your question. So your question is not whether you'll receive the same amount of money through the program or the Act, but the question is on reserve versus off reserve?
Yeah. Are they going to receive the same resources as for kids off reserve? Is it going to be the same? Has that been determined?
I think I would have to return with a written answer to your question, because I don't want to tell you something erroneously. But there are the Act does allow the program authorities typically are on reserve authorities. The Act authorities do allow things for like prevention services to happen off reserve. Absolutely.
So, for example, in the case of prevention services, is the same allotment per child going to be given to kids on reserve as off reserve?
Oh, I see. I would have to return with a written answer to that
I would like
question.
a written answer.
Okay, thank you. Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Moving on, is the allocations going to account for geographical differences? Like, for example, we know caring for kids in remote communities in terms of like main necessities, milk, right? Water, is much more expensive in rural and remote communities. Is the funding allocations going to account for regional differences?
That's a really important question. I think absolutely if you look at a community that's close to Vancouver, if you look at, a community that's close to Montreal versus a community that's in northern Manitoba, of course, the costs are different. And yes, that does account for that.
Yeah, so with all due respect, I'm answering all these questions related to financing after this current government just spent years battling in court over being found to be willfully racially discriminating against First Nations kids. We now have put forward Bill C-92. We're talking good talk about reconciliation, but we still haven't figured out the financial resources. There has been a pattern of normalized discrimination against Indigenous kids in this
Sorry,
country.
we're now half a minute over. So,
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, I've
Sorry.
given the card,
Thank
so,
you.
yeah.
Okay, you just,
If you just
I have
wrap
a
up your
paddle
thoughts,
here.
and then we'll pick it up the next
Okay,
time it comes
sorry
back to you.
about that.
Okay,
I'll
thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, next up, we have Mr. Shields, who will have, on this round, 5 minutes. So just give me a second to figure out how to... Okay, you're good for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the witnesses being here today. I really appreciate on a very crucial topic. So yes, we received the information about the number of people who have made requests. None have been approved to this point.
Regarding capacity building?
Yeah.
No, 223 have been
Proved that they're in place and working.
Yes.
So in that process, the funding has gone through a different flow mechanism. Will it 100% go directly to those 220?
Yes. So that we would use that money. It's called, and this is like, I'm sorry to bore you, it's like very bureaucratic speak, it's contribution money, so that would flow through a contribution agreement that is directly sent to the community. Yes.
You made reference to a 10-year, so this is not a one-year programming?
Let me explain. Thank you. So this capacity building is like the beginning of the road, right? This is the visioning part, and the 10-year agreement is once the coordination agreement has been executed. So typically, it depends on what the community wants to do. Several of those agreements are 10-year long-term agreements. So that's the difference. Yeah, many more communities are at the beginning of the road, right, than are at exercising jurisdiction at this point.
So we're a long ways away from that final.
It's a huge undertaking, absolutely. It's going to take significant work to get there, absolutely.
When you originally says moving quickly, and I go, geez, we're talking about the government here. That's an oxymoron, right? I mean, things don't happen quickly. This is going to be a long process.
I think that's a very fair point in terms of an overall critique of, pardon me. I think that in terms of what the Act is trying to do, and the Supreme Court was pretty clear about that, this process allows us to expedite things that can often take a lot longer because of the urgency. Like if you think about 2 years in the life of a 4-year-old, that's a very long time. So the point is to enable communities to move more quickly than they have been able to do previously, but it still is a huge undertaking. And what is also important to recognize that for First Nations community, the First Nations Child and Family Services Program funding has increased. So while this negotiation is happening, while these coordination discussion agreements are happening, the community is already able to put certain things in place because of the different funding that's available through the program.
And I think that's important to make that distinction because when you talk about quickly, we're talking about in youth in a sense at risk, the quicker the better. But yet there is a long process to go through to get it. When you're talking about a 10-year agreement at the end, this is a ways to get to that point.
It does take time to get to conclude a coordination agreement, absolutely. It usually takes more than 12 months.
Right.
Yes.
And we're not talking program funding on a yearly basis. That's totally off the table. This is long-term we're talking about.
Yes, so for First Nation communities, they can either continue with the First Nations program that exists, or they can exercise jurisdiction under the Act. It's their option.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to read a notice of motion.
Sorry?
When he's done.
Okay. Yeah, please
Given that
proceed.
the NDP Liberal carbon tax is set to increase to 23% on April 1st, 2024, and that most First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people living in rural areas that require access to affordable, stable, and reliable gas, groceries, and home heating to live, and that the Chiefs of Ontario have deemed the carbon tax discriminatory against First Nations, calling on the government to axe the tax, and after the government refused to do so, file for judicial review with the support of the Assembly of First Nations, Chief Cindy Woodhouse, and that the premiers of 7 provinces, the Premier of Northwest Territories, have called for the government to spike the hike. The committee recognized that the carbon tax disproportionately affects First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, and recognized that Indigenous communities across Canada are endangered are engaged in the development of natural resource projects for the benefit of current and future generations, contributing to economic reconciliation, and call on the Liberal government to immediately cancel a 23% carbon tax increase on April 1st and axe a tax for First Nations, Inuit, Métis across Canada, and report this to the House. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. You do still have 37 seconds on your time, although I do have a speaking list, so if we'll go to the speaking list. So, Mr. Schmale, you're first.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to my colleague Martin Shields for raising that very important motion. As he pointed out, 133 chiefs of Ontario have come out against the carbon tax. We've had multiple premiers, territorial leaders, all speaking about how the carbon tax has increased the cost of living for the people they represent. And I think the notices we've been getting about food bank usage at record highs, we hear from farmers that talk about how the carbon tax is increasing the price of their inputs, which of course increase the cost of food. We know that the carbon tax contributes to an increase in the price of home heating fuel. Even the Premier of Manitoba, the NDP Premier, took away the provincial tax on gasoline in order to give the residents of Manitoba a break on the cost of living, which is crippling Canadians from coast to coast. And when you look at food prices, especially in the north, they've always been high. But when you add this extra layer of tax onto that, you are increasing the cost of just living, trying to survive for thousands upon thousands of Canadians. And when they're struggling, when they're hurting, the idea that on April 1st, the carbon tax is going to go up yet again is deeply concerning to us on this side of the House. We often ask ourselves, why hasn't this been addressed sooner? Well, I think it could be a number of reasons, but this idea that you can tax people or tax the economy into prosperity isn't going to work. And it just feels like those who are advocating for a more expensive way of life aren't actually impacted at all by what is going on in the real world. It seems like the speeds are big government and bigger government in terms of how this is being addressed. It's very clear it is a tax plan, it's not an environmental plan. So why don't we look at what's been done in the past, which is setting rules and regulations that encourage industry to do what they do best and innovate. For decades, it's been the norm that government would say, well, we need to either lower emissions, we need to make cars more fuel efficient, and companies have responded. You've seen that in different models. They use different materials. They may use aluminum instead of this material. They may get more power out of a 4-cylinder than a 6-cylinder. There are a whole bunch of different ways, and then the market responds accordingly. Right now, we have the government picking one way of doing things. Companies then, of course, they're going to jump on this because there's billions of dollars being handed out. And so these jobs are being created based on government innovation. But it's not necessarily what the market is demanding, nor what the technology tells us. And when you look at the life cycle of where this material is mined, how the materials come together, it's not all that environmentally friendly. Even the recycling of the batteries, yes, technology is coming along to that because obviously there is a government push for this, But even those options available now are extremely expensive. Many companies have started to reevaluate how their business plan looks in terms of electric vehicles, and it seems the ones that aren't overly subsidized are pulling back. There are many looking at the hybrid model, which I think is where the market seems to be going in terms of customer demand. But at the same time, when we are in an affordability crisis, when we continue to borrow, driving up the cost of living, because of course we will very, very shortly spending more on interest on the national debt than we do on transfers to the provinces for health care, we are doing a disservice to future generations and really handcuffing the future to adapt to the needs of the citizens, of our children. And I just, for the life of me, when you look at the fact that emissions aren't going down, you're looking at the fact that spending is out of control, I think there is a better way. And in the next election, Canadians will have that opportunity to ask themselves, what is that better way? And I think they will find that common sense will prevail. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Next, I have Mr. Batiste.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to get back to talking about First Nations children in this community and in this committee in the future. I'd like to make a motion to adjourn debate so that we can continue on the important work that we have today.
So we'll call that question. So all in favor, do you want it recorded? No, that's a dilatory motion. There's no debate after it. So we have a motion to adjourn debate. So all in favor? We'd like that recorded. Okay.
Mr. Batiste?
Yes.
Mr. Carr? Ms. Gainey? Mr. McLeod? Mr. Pawlowski? I guess it's 4. Mr. Melillo?
Against.
Mr. Schmale?
Against.
Mr. Shields?
No.
Mr. Zimmer?
No.
Monsieur Lemire?
En faveur.
Ms. Gazan?
Support, in favor. Point of order, though, Chair.
Okay, your point of order.
I'm a visitor in this committee, and, I know this is politics here, but if they're going to talk about First Nations, I'm going to talk as a First Nations mother, and I can tell you the biggest issue in our community is child welfare and the fact that our kids are dying in the system, and the fact that the Conservatives in this committee today are talking about life and death and how hard it is for families. I'd like them to come to Manitoba, where 90% of the kids currently in care are First Nations, who are dying in the system, going murdered and missing as Indigenous women, and then we'll talk about urgency. I find it disgusting.
I'm going to stop there. That's not a point of order, but we've just
so that the public knows what games are being played on the backs of the lives of our kids in this committee.
Yeah, we have voted in favor of suspending debate, and so we will now return to the questions. And so next up, I have on my list Mr. McLeod, who will have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. Thank you for joining us today and providing us some very important information. I understand that the government of the Northwest Territories chose to intervene in this case before the Supreme Court in support of the government of Quebec's challenge to C-92, and their involvement in this case was strongly opposed by the Inuvialuit Regional Corporation, who have already passed their own child and family services law. Are you able to speak to the arguments brought forward by the government of Northwest Territories and how the Supreme Court's ruling addresses their arguments?
I turn to my justice colleagues.
Thank you for your question. Unfortunately, I'm not today, but if you'd like, we can follow up with a written response to that question.
Mr. Chair, I was hoping that we would have some very forensic information detail when you come to present to committee. This is my writing. This is their involvement. It kind of leaves me out in left field when witnesses come unprepared. I'll have to wait to get the information in writing, I guess. But I'll ask us another question. If the witnesses could provide an update on how Indigenous governments in the Northwest Territories are moving forward with their own self-determination following C92's implementation.
I can answer that question, and thank you for it. I think you made reference to the Inuvialuit Regional Corporation, who are in the process of negotiating a coordination agreement. That process continues. I can't speak to the confidential nature of those negotiations, certainly, but I do think that what you see for Northwest Territories is what you see elsewhere, is there's an affirmation that the work that's been happening under C92 can continue as the Act has been found to be constitutional.
My third question is regarding the challenges that may have been observed to date with off-reserve communities. As you probably know, the Northwest Territories has a majority number of Indigenous communities, but they're public communities, not on reserve. So how are these challenges facing some of the modern treaty governments in Northwest Territories and their ability to move forward with their own child and family services legislation?
Thank you for the question. I mean, absolutely, and the diversity of communities across the country is recognized throughout the statute, and it is a distinctions-based approach that we adopt in co-development with partners. We are in conversations with communities who are using modern treaties. We also have colleagues on the CERNA side of government that work directly with modern treaty holders, and there's an optionality that's available to those communities, whether they wish to use the Act or they wish to use the modern treaty process. To access child and family services jurisdiction.
I see in section 22, brackets 3 of C92 that Indigenous laws prevail over provincial or territorial laws in case of conflict. Could you tell us why that was important to include it in the bill?
I'll defer to my Department of Justice colleagues. Thank you.
I can certainly comment on how that section works. I don't know that I have the background in terms of the intentionality behind inclusion of the provision, but if it's useful, I can talk about what that provision and what Section 21 does. Really what 22.3 is putting in place the legal doctrine of federal paramountcy. So basically, that provides that provisions of a federal law will prevail over a provincial law. So the combination of Section 21 and 22.3 mean that Indigenous laws become incorporated as federal laws under the Act, and then through that incorporation by reference process, those Indigenous laws then are paramount over provincial laws if there is a conflict or a situation of an inconsistency. So significant provision in terms of ensuring that those laws are paramount over the provincial laws that could be inconsistent.
Okay, thank you. We're out of time, and we'll now go to Monsieur Lemire for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur. Thank you, Chair. Indigenous children are removed from their families, citing different reasons, including improper housing conditions And parents and Indigenous communities sometimes do not have control over these factors due to lack of financing, which of course is something that could be solved by the federal government. So in the context that's before us, where we're looking at $1 billion that's been distributed, I'd like to know how much of that money has been distributed in Quebec to date, and how these negotiations have taken place, and what communities have benefited from this funding. You're asking this in connection with the coordination agreements? Well, we are negotiating currently with Obidjewin community, but the amounts are not known yet, and the amounts will be will be clear by the end of the year, at the end of the negotiation process. It's been 4 years since the act received royal assent, and there's been court challenges. So if I understand correctly, things have been put on pause in the meantime, rather than moving forward and distributing this money. So as a result, it's still, once again, the children that are paying the price. So the Department of Justice maybe can answer this question. What precedent does the ruling of the court sets? Because the Quebec was asking for a respect for its jurisdiction, but what kind of precedent does this create in terms of the relations with the provinces?
So, merci pour votre.
Thank you for your question. I'm going to answer in English.
Court found that the law was within federal legislative jurisdiction. So in terms of extrapolating going forward, it's an opinion of the court, it's not a decision, so technically it's not binding, but it is treated as a precedent. Ultimately, they did find it is within federal Parliament's legislative jurisdiction. So it's very difficult to speculate in terms of going forward what this means. I think they were very careful to speak directly to the legislation that was in front of them and the question that was in front of them.
Je pense qu'on peut quand même spéculer que si vous avez la compétence.
You could still speculate that if you have the jurisdiction, you're going to pay for it.
Ms. Gazan, you have 2.5 minutes.
Yes, thank you so much. So we're talking about children and reconciliation. I know I asked you a number of questions about Bill C-92 and monies attached. Recently, actually, the Conservatives put forward a bill, Bill C-318. I offered up amendments that were supported by the sponsor of the bill to include in the new EI funding regime for adoption, to include kinship and customary care to ensure that this government was upholding the rule of law, which now includes Article 5 of Bill C-15, which states that the Government of Canada, in quotes, must, in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples, take all measures necessary to ensure that the laws of Canada are consistent with the Declaration. It passed in committee, making the bill now consistent with Article 19, 20, 21 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It was thrown out by the Liberal government, even though they have the ability to provide rural consent. I wrote a letter, in fact, to the government on February 27th, 2024. The government still has an opportunity to uphold the rule of law. I'm wondering if we're talking about reunifying kids. We know that 90% of kids in care, certainly in Manitoba, are First Nations, often in kinship and customary arrangements. Does this government have any plan to uphold the rule of law and amend that legislation?
For me, I would be unable to answer that question. I can certainly endeavor to provide you with a written answer. It's outside my purview.
Yes, I do think we require a written answer, but I also think it's very timely because if you're not willing to change legislation when you're talking about child welfare systems that will essentially exclude 90% of the kids in care, it's probably not a very effective piece of legislation. I know that the government currently has a Bill C, I believe it's C-59 in place around adoptive care. I'm wondering if the government has any plans to ensure that they uphold the rule of law and make sure that it's consistent with Bill C-15 and Articles 19, 20, and 21 in terms of adoption care. Is there any plans
We're out of
for that?
time, but if
Okay,
you can answer
thank
briefly
you.
in a sentence or two, that would be appreciated.
To speak to that question, but I can certainly bring it back. Yes,
That would be great. Thanks.
thank you.
And our clerk will be keeping track, or is keeping track of all of the written questions, so we'll be following up with those. We will now move to Mr. Melillo, who will have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here on this important discussion. Just want to quickly ask, I guess, a higher level question in terms of the process of coming to this legislation. Could you speak, and for anyone who could speak to it, the consultation process and how this was developed, if there were perhaps either some other proposals or suggestions to how this could be brought forward throughout that process, and what led you to the framework that exists today?
Thank you for the question. I'll start, and then I'll turn to my colleague Isabel Cantal to answer that question. I think, this was the result of a convening of many partners to try to address what was considered a national emergency, which remains a very urgent matter about the overrepresentation of Indigenous children across the country. And for further details, I'll turn to Isabel.
So thank you very much for this. Yes, indeed, the Minister of Indigenous Services Canada in 2019 called an emergency meeting where Indigenous partner provinces and territories were all gathered together to assess the fact that there was an overrepresentation of children in care. During that meeting, there was an agreement that 6 points of action were developed and were going to be enforced. One of those points of action was the creation of a legislation that will allow Indigenous groups to take care of their children. So with that commitment and desire of fulfilling that point of action, Department of Indigenous Services Canada met with over 2,000 Indigenous people, let it be elders, youth, agencies, communities, provinces and territories, to gather their views on what would that look like. I think that the engagement process of the development of C-92 is really a co-development process, and it led to what is now the Act.
Okay, thank you. And just quickly, just with limited time, will the ruling itself, the Supreme Court ruling, or the process of getting to the ruling, how does it impact not only this legislation, but perhaps future legislation?
I can turn to my justice colleagues. I think it's difficult to speculate, but I'll turn to them for comment.
Can I just clarify in terms of your question? Do you mean in terms of the consultation and cooperation process?
In terms of the Supreme Court process and the ruling that came of it.
How will it influence future legislation? That is really difficult to speculate. The court was, as I mentioned before, the court was very careful to stick to the nature of this legislation, the affirmations made within it. But it did affirm that very positively that this kind of legislation was within federal legislative jurisdiction. So, I think that's what we can take from the decision.
So thank you very much. Thank you for those answers. And just very quickly, Mr. Chair, while I have the floor, I'd just like to give notice of a motion. I want to be clear, I'm not moving the motion. I just want to provide the notice for it while I have the opportunity. And simply the motion would be as follows. Given that First Nations and Inuit police services do important work to keep members of the communities they serve safe, that in the opinion of the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs, these police services provide an essential service and should be declared essential, and that this be reported to the House. That's the entire substance of the motion. Mr. Chair, I'd just like to briefly speak to it as well, and why I'm bringing it forward. Obviously, First Nation and Inuit police services do provide essential services for the residents that they serve. The government has, in the past, spoken about the need for legislation to ensure that there's proper designation of them as essential. But Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, that was promised in 2022. 2 years later, the government still hasn't acted on it.
Sorry, I'm just going to jump in. We are straying into the kind of out of what's allowed right now.
Okay.
You were doing the notice of motion. Now we're getting into debate on the motion, which, because it's not in order at this point, I'd say we probably shouldn't be going there. There'll be time to debate it when we get to it.
Understood.
You still have about 40 seconds on the round on your questions if you want to go back to that.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that. Just say I look forward to having a more wholesome discussion on that motion at the appropriate time, and I hope I'd be able to get support from colleagues across the table on that, as it is very important to people across the country and to First Nations and Inuit in particular that unfortunately we've seen tragic circumstances as a result of this underfunding and lack of proper funding from the federal government. So I think I've exhausted my time there, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. We will now go to Mr. Batiste, who will have 5 minutes.
Yes, you had mentioned the Supreme Court introducing this notion of legislative reconciliation. And specifically, the court noted, and this is the court's words, not mine, is that reconciliation is a long-term project. It will not be accomplished through a single sacred moment, but rather through a continuous transformation of relationships and braiding together distinct legal traditions. And we had talked a little bit about what UNDRIP, what this could possibly mean for the future. And I'm wondering if you could talk to us about how can implementation of UNDRIP contribute to resolving issues surrounding the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in care?
Maybe I can speak to it generally, and then my colleagues from Indigenous Services can speak to the program. So the UN Declaration has been described as a framework for reconciliation in Canada, and the court references that in their decision, and as I mentioned earlier, speaks really highly of this legislation that Parliament passed. It talks about legislative reconciliation as an enactment of legislation to respect, promote, protect, and accommodate inherent rights through mechanisms of frameworks elaborated upon within the statute. And so when they looked at the construction of this statute, particularly recognizing the jurisdiction of Indigenous governments and the really essential character of the relationship between parents and children and families and communities, and how essential that healing is and having some autonomy over those relationships is to reconciliation. So the court certainly does consider all of those different aspects of law and the UN Declaration in particular in reaching its opinion. But in terms of the program itself, I don't know if my colleagues want to add.
Thank you for that. And I think, really the purpose of the Act is to further UNDRIP's, purpose as well, which is really to ensure that decisions that are made about the most important relationships are made by the people who are directly affected by them, which is Indigenous communities themselves. So the purpose really being to reassert jurisdiction where it has been for thousands of years, and for that support to be a bit different than what we've seen historically in child welfare, to really be prevention-based and to be strengths-based in terms of what a community has to offer its children.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about the map that was handed out here. I noticed that there's a lot of different provinces and territories that are on here. As someone who's from Nova Scotia, I'm noticing that Nova Scotia is not one of those with a dot, as well as Nunavut. And so I'm wondering if we can speak to why is there seemingly no active update or progress happening in those two areas?
Thank you for the question. I think it really does depend on which communities want to do what when. And the Act is one tool. There are many tools in terms of what communities are already actively doing. So if you don't see something on the map right here, it doesn't mean that there's not change happening in terms of child and family services. And I would say I work on the Act side. My colleagues who work on the program side have seen many, many changes, particularly Mi'kmaq, Nova Scotia, around preventive care, around rethinking what exactly they're trying to do. So I do think that what you see here is a partial representation of the overall area of work that's happening. And we always go at the pace that communities wish to proceed.
And so just to be crystal clear on this, the money that's, I think it's more than $40 billion that's out there, Nova Scotia, despite having their own Mi'kmaq family child and family services, will be eligible for all of the money that's, a portion of that money that comes from this will actually be going into Nova Scotia, correct?
Certainly, absolutely.
Okay. So in my last bit of time, I just wanted to talk a little bit about Jordan's Principle. And there's a lot of discussion around some of the delays that have been, that are out there. I'm wondering if the department could talk a little bit about concerns about the delays in processing Jordan's Principle claims and what this could possibly mean moving forward. And so how are we remedying these delays or what is seen as non-action?
Thank you for that question. We do work alongside colleagues in Jordan's Principle. It's not our area of work. I do understand, and we'll get you a written answer to that question, but I do understand there's been a significant increase in requests as communities understand better what's available under Jordan's Principle, and that there's active work being undertaken to address any delays. But we'll provide you with a written answer on that question. Thank you.
I'm good.
That time. So we have time for one more round of 15 minutes, so it'll be 5 minutes, 5 minutes, 2.5, 2.5. And with that, we'll jump right to it with Mr. Shields going first for the Conservatives for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just going back to the information that, just to clarify, and I appreciate the information you've given us, you've got 7 coordinated agreements have been signed. Can you define what a coordinated agreement is?
Yes, so a coordination agreement is basically an agreement about the assertion of jurisdiction and what the community is going to do, what are the funding frameworks that are built therein. And basically, it's the tripartite agreement that exists to support the exercise of jurisdiction by a given Indigenous community.
3 parties are at the table then.
Yes.
What's the provincial role in this agreement?
Well, you can imagine typically over the years, and I think you mentioned this earlier, provinces have been very active in providing child and family services, particularly off reserve, and it's a coordination, right? Like the title sort of gives it all, right? It needs to be a coordinated a coordination of services across those areas, so that, for example, if a child is living off reserve, but a community has a sort of jurisdiction over, a whole geographic area, then those 2 areas have spoken to each other, and there is a plan about what is going to happen to support that child and that family. So all those pieces are built into the coordination agreement. There's an incredible amount of planning, which is part of the reason why it's time-consuming.
So that would lead me to believe then that the provincial organizations still have a large role to play in the enactment of these agreements.
In terms of like the planning, yeah, absolutely. We think that the tripartite role is very important.
Once it's implemented, though, let's talk about in the sense of when we're talking about nations and the services that they may provide on their nation, but they may be looking to contract outside of their nation. Is the province involved in that, in your opinion?
In terms of what agreements that may exist after a coordination agreement's been signed, that certainly depends on the given Indigenous governing body and how they've developed their model. It'll depend from case to case.
So the latitude could be for a variety of them, that the First Nation may have an agreement with the province to contract or to an independent contractor?
Both are certainly possible.
So the provincial organizations we see now, which can be fairly extensive as this program has been in place for children for a long time, they could still have a significant role?
Well, I think you're putting your finger right on it. It's a different role in terms of where the jurisdiction lies and also where the decision-making lies. The decision-making, when jurisdiction's been assumed, lies with the community. What the different vehicles that may be necessary to, for example, provide an emergency service in a city, that is for the community to determine and may involve contracting with a provincial body. However, the decision-making process lies with the community.
So the ultimate decision is with the nation that signs that agreement, in your belief, because you haven't got an agreement signed at the end yet.
There are 7 that exist now.
Coordination agreements, but you haven't signed off on a final agreement with anybody yet.
No, there are 7. Those 7 to which I'm referring are finalized. And there are nations that are exercising jurisdiction. Yes.
So 7 coordination agreements have been signed. So
Yes.
when I asked you earlier, are there any in place that actually, and I thought I got the answer no.
Oh, I apologize if I spoke that way. No, what I mean to say is that there are 7 Indigenous governing bodies in Canada that are exerting jurisdiction over their child and family services, yes.
Which is what I thought. So your answer confused me.
I apologize.
So what is the monitoring mechanism for those agreements? Is there any role of monitoring, or now are they standalone? Are they separated totally from the federal government and provincial, they're making the decisions totally?
Well, it is a self-governing agreement, so the decision-making process, as in any self-government, would rely with the community, yes.
Okay, so that process has happened. 7 are totally independent, those nations making decisions on child welfare. So how long is that first one, how long have these 7 been in place?
Since 2023.
Okay, so this is brand new,
That's right.
and you're looking at 223 more being done in how long?
You know, that's a very good question. It does depend upon the pace at which communities wish to proceed, so that is in their hands.
They are the ones that move the needle?
That indicates, so Section 20 of the Act, there's 2 mechanisms for them to sort of signal whether they wish to proceed to assert jurisdiction or which they want to do it via a coordination agreement. So they have those 2 mechanisms, and yes, that is under the community's control.
This would represent, when you say 223 plus 7, so 230, there's 600 and some 30 nations in the country. This takes a long time for these ones. We still have 2/3 of the nations that have not entered this process.
That's right.
That's
Done.
yep, the end of the time. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. East, who has 5 minutes.
Thank you. In July 2020, the Assembly of First Nations and the Government of Canada signed the protocol concerning the implementation of the Act of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Children, Youth, and Families. Now, among other of the protocol aims to, and this is in quote, inform a process for collaboration and cooperation with First Nations peoples on regulations supporting implementation of the legislation. I have 2 questions on that. Firstly, how are we ensuring First Nations participation when we're going through the initial stages of this process? And can you also talk to us a little bit about why there's a need for regulations during this implementation? What do we anticipate the regulations? When does the department anticipate the regulations will be developed?
Thank you for that. I'll turn to my colleague, Ms. Cantel.
Thank you for the question. Regulations are a tool that could be used to reinforce some element of the legislation. Other elements can also be developed that, are outside the regulation, let it be guidance or policies that could be helping this. One of the elements that we will be doing is, as you know, in the legislation, it mentions that there is a mandatory 5 years review. We will be engaging with partners, like communities, at the community level, at the NIO's level, with provinces and territory as well, to see what kind of amendment or improvement they could see in the legislation. Regulations will also be discussed in that engagement process. So far, what we have learned pertaining to regulation is there might be a need pertaining to the minimum standards, and it's in their application. So we will see, once again, this is going to be co-developed, and it will be what we will be hearing from partners that will, get moved forward.
Okay. So does anyone else want to talk about the participation of First Nations as part of this moving forward, the collaborative process?
Certainly the legislation was co-developed, and the plan is to continue co-development of its implementation. That's certainly been our approach, and that's what we'll continue to do.
So in the final 2 minutes that I have, we've got this Supreme Court ruling, we have funding in place, but as pointed out, processes. How can we make sure that we're getting the funding to the communities that need them right now? I know that it's not always a process of going fast is what the federal government does, but what can we do better to ensure that we're getting the money to the communities that need them? Is there a way that we can make it more flexible for communities to access this money before they have to go through this? Like, what is the obstacles that are there, and how can we make sure that we're getting the funding to the communities faster?
It's a great question. You know, my colleague referred to the 5-year review of the legislation, and I think the best answers to those questions often come from communities in terms of what they've learned along the way. So just recently, and several months ago, Louisville Tribe did host, a forum on lessons learned about using C-92 as a tool to enact jurisdiction. And so we are trying to make sure that we always listen to those lessons around, is capacity building broad enough? Does it do enough? Does it answer all of our questions? And then also we really see, as we often see with these types of initiatives, the strength of communities helping each other to figure out, this is what we did, here's where we found it challenging, here's what worked really well, to try and make that always as smooth as possible.
And with that being said, would you say that there's some best practices out there with which nations or tribal organizations that are actually have gone through this process and are now receiving the funds that can help other nations along this journey?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that we've really seen that communities are starting to talk about wanting to have more opportunities to share those best practices, and those conversations, I think, are happening across the country. We hear that very frequently.
Can you name a few that, just if someone's watching and saying, which community is getting this right? How have they been able to access the money so quickly?
I mean, I think that there's I don't think there's any getting it wrong or getting it right. It's like doing what makes sense at a given moment in time. I think we've seen huge success at Peguis First Nation around reducing the number of children coming into care. We've heard that from their leadership. I know Louisville Tribe has been very happy to share its experiences around, putting the act into place. I think, Splatskene First Nation as well, doing a lot of incredible work. And across those coordination agreements, we've seen tremendous success. And it's also, what's really encouraging about it is the pace at which that change can happen when communities have been able to put this into action.
And are we offering with Assembly of First Nations the ability for those communities to pass on that knowledge to other communities interested in going down this route?
I mean, certainly in terms of the capacity building funding, we do support the Assembly of First Nations, yes.
And now we'll go to Monsieur Lemire for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In your departmental plan 2023-24, Indigenous Services Canada says the following. There's a risk of uncertainty about the interpretation of the legislation of the Act, and that could lead to frustration and compromise relations with Indigenous partners, provinces, and territories. And we've been observing for a long time now that great sums of money have been going back to the Treasury. Can you tell me how that could be prevented, and how can we make sure that Indigenous peoples and communities can manage their new responsibilities so that they can really meet the real needs of their communities? How can they have an easy access, and ultimately that these amounts do not go back to the Treasury, which happens quite often when we're talking about sums of money sent to Indigenous communities? We have to develop their communities. They are asking for this, of course, especially First Nations in Quebec and Labrador have been saying that, and the answer has been quite vague about the amounts that have been made available and the negotiation procedures. So that's frustrating, and that could compromise the relations between the partners. So what measures are you thinking about implementing to answer this need and meet the real needs of the communities? Thank you for the question. We have to face this criticism with flexible long-term financing that is managed by the communities themselves. So I'm fully aware of this sort of criticism, and there are very onerous administrative burdens, but we are trying to overcome with the situation with subsidies, and that is always part of the coordination agreements. These are long-term agreements, and there's internal flexibility to allow the communities to prioritize where they are going to spend the amounts, and that they can introduce prevention measures as well. Thank you for this long-term vision. I think it is fundamental. It is really desired and requested, and this ruling, of course, gives the charge of allowing for this at the end of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Perfect timing. And no, we'll go now to Ms. Gazan for the final 2.5 minutes.
Thank you so much. I just want to clarify, I mean, it's often said that it's at the pace that communities want to go. I just want to clarify it's not really at the pace. I don't think we've ever not wanted jurisdiction over our kids. It's about the funding and resources that are providing to give back our human rights and uphold UNDRIP so that we can care for our kids. Going to the full economic statement 23-24, the department plan sunset of funding includes budget 2021 for mental health and wellness, specifically, though, funding from budget 2019 for continued implementation of Jordan's Principle and supporting Inuit children, and funding to support individual compensation, capital expenditures, and immediate reforms of First Nations Child and Family Services and Jordan's Principle. So what I find odd, we talk about Bill C-92, still no kind of plans for money. Jordan's Principle keeps kids alive in my community, even though it's often not provided or given out in a timely manner in terms of service providers. That is sunsetting. I put forward amendments to EI to make sure that EI regimes would be consistent with how we choose to care how we choose to care for our children. As an affirmed right in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It seems that there's no consistency with this government on when it's going to uphold the rule of law when it comes to Indigenous human rights, particularly in relation to our children, depending on what legislation it is, or when it isn't going to do that. And what concerns me about that is that if there isn't a plan for total legislative reform, is this government really serious about implementing UNDRIP? Because we can't change things if people don't want to pay for it. There's a cost to violent colonization. One of the violent costs is the fact that we have an overrepresentation in the child welfare system. Is there any plan to make sure that legislation is consistent to affirm our right to have self-determination over the care of our children, whether it's EI, Jordan's Principle, or Bill C-92?
Thank you. I'll defer to my justice colleagues around that.
What I can speak to is the UN Declaration Action Plan, which has over 180 measures, and within that there are a number of potential legislative measures and the act itself, the UN Declaration Act that I think you mentioned earlier, as well as the first priority in the UN Declaration Action Plan, requires the government to create a process to ensure laws are consistent with UN Declaration.
Right, but that was supposed to be done within 2 years, and it's gone much past the 2 years. That's
we
the
are out
problem.
of time, so I'd say just finish up your response briefly, and then we'll need to finish. Okay, thank you. So with that, we are out of time, and I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here with us this morning. It's been a good discussion. There are a number of questions that we have asked, and members have asked for follow-up, and so we'll be getting those questions to you, and I would encourage you to get them back to us as soon as you can. With that, colleagues, we are going to suspend, and for anybody online, I'll ask you to, as quickly as possible, log back in to the in-camera link that was sent to you. And then we have committee business that we'll be returning, so we'll suspend for a few minutes and get back in as soon as we can. Thank you. Meeting suspended.